This is Street Signals, a weekly conversation about markets and macro, brought to you by State Street Markets. I'm your host, Tim Graff, head of macro strategy for Europe. Each week, we talk about the latest insights from our award-winning research, as well as the current thinking from our strategists, traders, business leaders, clients, and other experts from financial markets. If you listen to us and like what you're hearing, please subscribe, leave us a good review, get in touch. It all helps us to improve what we offer. With that, here's what's on our minds this week. We finished 2025 with an annual tradition, our rundown of the best books and other media that we've read, listened to, or watched during the year just gone. Every year for the last 12, the macro strategy team at State Street Markets publishes a document called 3 Things to Read This Year. As the name suggests, each team member contributes and writes up 3 brief reviews of selections of media that resonated with them over the year and made their best of list for 2025 in this case. These are typically books. We're all big readers, but we've also featured podcasts, papers, long-form articles, and films. I compile and edit everything, I write a little preamble, and we usually package and put it out the week before Christmas as a gift to our readers, giving you ideas of how to pass the time during what's hopefully a less hectic moment of the year. That document is now out. It's on our Insights platform, which you can get if you're a client of State Street. But of course, in doing a podcast version of the document, I know that doing 3 different recommendations from 14 different people would probably get a little long and probably quite boring. So as we've also been doing the last couple of years, we whittle it down each year and ask for one choice from each of the team members to talk about. And just like we did for our Year Ahead episode a couple of weeks ago, I got the whole team to contribute a recording detailing their choice for this week's episode. That's what follows. It's a really varied mix of books, more so than in most years, in fact. And with such a wide range of offerings, it probably makes sense to begin with a recommendation for a book on maps and global geography from Noel Dixon.
My choice for book of the year is Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. This captivating read makes the case that geography fundamentally influences nations, politics, economies, and foreign policy. Leaders' decisions are often shaped by natural obstacles such as mountains, rivers, deserts, and seas, which can make certain choices inevitable. Through 10 current maps, Marshall examines how landscapes and climates both limit and empower major countries around the world. He discusses Russia's expansive tundra and lack of physical barriers, which drives its security concerns, China's mountainous borders and exposed eastern coasts, Africa's deserts and disconnected river systems, and South America's Amazon rainforest restricting integration. Altogether, these geographic factors help clarify many global geopolitical realities we witness today. It's an exceptional book and offers a fresh perspective for understanding world events. Definitely worth a read.
This year, I published the document in random author order, and my name came up second in the document. So my top read of 2025 was a book called Season of the Witch, Enchantment, Terror, and Deliverance in the City of Love by David Talbot. Someone once wrote that there are only 3 American cities that are so unique that no matter what random street you might be dropped on, you'll know exactly what cities you're in: New Orleans, New York, and San Francisco. Season of the Witch is a social and political history of San Francisco, from the emergence of the counterculture in the 1960s up to the AIDS crisis and progress of the gay rights movement in the mid-1980s. Along the way, featured players include the Grateful Dead, the Diggers, Charles Manson, the Zodiac Killer, Patty Hearst and the Symbionese Liberation Army, the Reverend Jim Jones and his People's Temple, Harvey Milk, Armistead Maupin, and of course the San Francisco 49ers. What I loved about this book is, first of all, how interesting it is and how much it reminded me that San Francisco and the Bay Area are, for good or ill, drivers of American culture and industry. Alongside all the utopian visions and creativity of the 60s and in Silicon Valley today, it's important to understand that destruction often must accompany creativity across all paths of life. Now, next up, we hear from Ning Sun, who opens a series of Anglo-American focused books with one about the US dollar.
The book I want to talk today is Our Dollar, Your Problem by Ken Rogoff. This is a book that helps explain one of the defining features of today's currency markets, the structural dominance of the US dollar. Rogoff, a former IMF chief economist and Harvard professor, takes us on the sweeping journey through the post-World War II rise of the US dollar. He argues that America's currency did not reach its dominant position today purely by design. It outlasted rivals like the Japanese yen, the Soviet ruble, and even the euro, becoming the backbone of global trade and finance. But here's the catch. Rogoff also warns that the so-called Pax dollar era may not last forever. He points to mounting challenges for the dollar, such as cryptocurrencies, China's push for yuan internationalization, the end of low inflation and interest rates, and political divide and instability in the US itself today. Many countries are also very frustrated with the system that leaves them vulnerable to US monetary policy decisions. What makes the book actually compelling, I think, is Rogoff's insider perspective. He blends history with personal anecdotes. From decades of working alongside policymakers and world leaders, the result is both a narrative of past triumphs and a sober look at the road ahead. His central message, the dollar's supremacy is powerful, but with prices to pay for the US, and Americans should not take it for granted. If you are curious about the greenback, how the greenback became the world's currency, and whether this can stay here forever, this book is a must-read.
Fred Goodwin, Mr. Risk, and I are both Americans who've spent a lot of time in the UK, so his book caught my eye. Here he is.
The Mr. Risk book of the year is called Vassal State, How America Runs Britain. It's by Angus Hatton. This is nothing short of provocative, shocking, and detailed when it comes to exposing the dark side of UK's special relationship with the US. The idea is that Britain is a subservient partner, akin to Belarus' relationship to Russia. The U.S. has achieved dominance through capitalism by owning Britain's assets. U.S. corporations and private equity firms own vast swaths of British brands. U.S. companies generate vast revenue, but are skillful when it comes to avoiding tax. The digital economy has morphed into cultural and digital hegemony. British consumers rely on U.S. hardware, software, and platforms. He argues that Britain's best and brightest are migrating to U.S. institutions. Hatton blames the UK politicians for courting this takeover as they prioritized FDI and private equity buyouts over local stability. The author calls for an end to abject dependency. Anyone who is a fan of economic liberalism or British is going to find this book hard to put down, but probably a bit upsetting.
British history features prominently in another one of our choices from Dan Gerard.
One of my favorite books for 2025, The Bible and Sword, was written in 1956. I'm a huge fan of accessible histories like those from David McCullough and Robert Caro, histories that bring you inside the stories of the times and their characters. Both of those authors have cited Barbara Tuchman as a tremendous influence on their style. Tuchman won the Pulitzer Prize for The Guns of August in the 1960s, but Bible and Sword was written just prior to this, in the immediate years post-World War II. The book focuses on the characters and stories that drove Great Britain's ambitions and entanglements with historical Palestine from 1000 BC through the Roman period, the Moors, the Ottoman Empire, and finally, the Balfour Declaration when the UK re-established the Jewish homeland in 1917. It's an expansive undertaking, but it's witty and entertaining, and it brings familiar characters to life. Anyone looking for a deeper and wider understanding of the region's history and the surprising motivations would rip through this book as I did. Highly recommend.
Now, where Fred is an American who had a book about U.S. dominance of the UK, next up is a Brit, Lee Farage, who has a book about an outsider's look at the American economy.
So my chosen book is Economics in America, An Immigrant Economist Explores the Land of Inequality by Angus Deaton. As an immigrant economist, well, sort of, in the US myself, this book naturally caught my attention. In it, Nobel Prize winner Deaton explores the US economy with an outsider's very trained eye and emerges with some truly insightful conclusions. Nothing is spared, and the land of academia in the US is a particular source of concern for Deaton, despite his obvious success in the field. He also looks at wider issues facing the US, including, but not exclusively, poverty, retirement, the minimum wage, and the healthcare system. Why did I like it? The way Deaton writes is punchy and to the point, which I really enjoyed. You don't have to be a UK economist living in the US to enjoy it. Maybe it helps, but I think the wider audience would also enjoy Deaton's very thoughtful and punchy take on a lot of the big issues facing the US today.
Kayla Sater follows that up with an exploration of gender data bias and its effects across all facets of life.
My 2025 book recommendation is Invisible Women Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. This book highlights how pervasive gender biases in data affect everything from product design to medicine to urban planning, and this all results in systemic misallocation of resources. Really, the biggest impact of this book and why you need to read it is timing. We know the gender data gap is real, but it's even more dangerous today in the era of AI. Because as AI reshapes our world, we need to be asking the hard questions like what data are being used to train these models? Because biased data inevitably leads to biased outcomes. Invisible Women serves as a powerful reminder that we need to ask the right questions to ensure data that are driving our decisions is truly representative and useful. So I hope you all check it out.
In our Year Ahead podcast 2 weeks ago, we had 4 different trade ideas centered around Japan and its rate, FX, and equity market outlooks. Ben Luck complements his trade idea of going long Japanese equities with his book choice.
The book I would like to suggest everybody to take a look at is called The Curse of Japaneseness, an old nation bound by its own system, and the author is Tetsuya Nishihara. Japan's cultural and institutional framework has once been considered as a source of strength, but in today's world, it's really been a constraint in terms of actually growing the overall economy. The book captures the historical roots of Japan's social and institutional system and highlights why changes to that system is very difficult for the country. Key themes includes understanding the culture, the rigidity of corporate practices, the stagnation in growth, and obviously demographic challenges that Japan has. And most importantly, as we go into the next few years, identity versus AI modernization. And really the biggest question remains on whether or not Japan can find prosperity under the new leadership of Prime Minister Senai Takaishi.
Just in time for a cup of Christmas cheer, we now have Marvin Lowe and his book on what nuclear holocaust might look like.
Nuclear War by Annie Jacobson takes a look at what it would take to start a catastrophic nuclear war. We've been able to avoid such a conflict for 60 plus years based on the concept of mutually assured destruction. Effectively, there are so many of these bombs out there that if a superpower were to launch an attack against another, it almost guarantees the destruction of everyone involved. What happens when a small arsenal is launched by a rogue nation against a superpower? The natural response would be for that superpower to launch a nuclear decapitation counteroffensive intended to stop that rogue nation from attacking again. But the risk is that that will pull in other superpowers and create a cascading series of devastating events. There are off-ramps, however, and the author takes a minute-by-minute review of the chain of commands that will either escalate or de-escalate the situation. The checks and balances built into the U.S. nuclear protocol are in fact impressive, but the overwhelming number of decisions that have to be made with almost perfect insight to avoid escalation is overwhelming. The challenge also is that there's a very short period of time with which to make those decisions, with the launch of an ICBM attack requiring a counteroffensive within an hour. So why read a book like this? As nuclear scientists point out, these weapons aren't going away, and education is power. We can only hope that those closer to the situation are taking the same approach to education so that they can create an environment of better deterrence.
3 years ago, we suggested a lot of books that helped us make sense of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That conflict is, of course, still ongoing, and Carlin Doyle has one more book to consider.
My choice of book for 2025 comes from the pen of Russian-born Ukrainian writer Andrei Kurkov, who is perhaps more familiarly known for his novels set in the post-Soviet period and include the likes of Death and the Penguin. By contrast, Our Daily War is a diary of his adoptive country and follows the Russian invasion of 2022. It is a profoundly moving account of the conflict which catalogues the shock, horror, and brutality of Russia's war of aggression. alongside tales of everyday humanity and sometimes comedy. Kurkov reveals the many ways that ordinary citizens have made a difference to alleviate the suffering of their fellow Ukrainians. For his part, Kurkov, as an author with global readership, claims through the diary the role of Ukrainian cultural ambassador, taking to the wider world a message of resilience and resistance, as well as countering Russia's erroneous narrative of the conflict.
Economics books are never far from our minds, and Michael Metcalf has one more to consider for this year.
My pick this year is The Winner's Curse by Richard Thaler and Alex Imos. So when I think back to my first year undergraduate microeconomics course, I can't say I've got that many fond memories, but I do remember enjoying Richard Thaler's anomalies papers. Unlike the heavy mathematics and unrealistic assumptions that often dominate micro, what I remembered was that these papers just use simple logic, real human behavior, and they sort of explain why markets failed in a pretty entertaining and accessible way. So when I saw that the papers had been compiled and updated, I was keen to see if the ideas still held water 31 years later, and boy, do they. Papers are now supplemented with thousands of lab experiments and real-world examples that are built on his original insights. And of course, in the process, I mean, this is laying the foundations here for behavioral economics, which is it's like almost like a review of it. And then financial markets in particular, which obviously is my main interest, are still much less efficient than we'd like to believe. And of course, his primary example of that is how winning stocks potentially and regularly become losing ones in the future, which of course has an incredible amount of relevance for the outlook for 2026, as do the violations of the law of one price, which is another market failure. And here, meme stocks, you now get a new anomaly all of their own as a paper. So look, to summarize, while this book might not be the most optimal use of your time, if you're even a little curious about why people sometimes make mistakes in their choices or appear irrational, or why things like Liverpool signing Alexander Isak was probably always destined to be a misstep. That's page 20, by the way. You're going to likely find this a read that maximizes your satisfaction. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.
Even though the broader publication we did is loaded with fiction book choices, remember, you can get that publication on Insights. The only one that actually made this podcast was Maria Waitmana's choice.
As Long as a Lemon Tree Grows by Zofia Katush. This is probably the most beautiful book I ever read. This is definitely the most harrowing book I ever read. The story is set in war-torn Syria as Bashar Assad's regime tried to suppress revolution. Main character is 18-year-old Salama, pharmacy student who volunteers in a local hospital. She received wounded after the air raid, tries to stitch them up, cool the burns, reduce the pain, but mostly hears the prayers as they pass away. She is devastated and terrified for her own life, for her pregnant sister's life. She loves Syria, its people, its sunsets, her own memories, but she is scared. She ends up giving her family gold to a smuggler for a seat on a boat to safety across Mediterranean. Her only prayer was, "Bury me before I bury you." I cried while reading this book, and then I planted a lemon tree.
Max Hofstetter has been with our team for about a minute, but it's so great that he wanted to contribute to the project this year. Here's his choice.
United States of Distraction takes a hard look at how our media and politics have turned into a circus and what that means for democracy. Mickey Huff and Nolan Higdon show us how nonstop entertainment, clickbait headlines, and corporate control have left us tuned in but totally distracted. Instead of digging into real issues like inequality, climate change, and corruption, we're fed shallow stories that keep us passive. The book explains how decades of deregulation and profit-driven news created this mess, and how misinformation shapes what we believe. But it's not all doom and gloom. The authors offer practical steps to fight back, like becoming media literate, supporting independent journalism, and getting involved in civic life. United States of Distraction isn't just a critique, it's a call to action to reclaim an informed society, demand accountability. If you've ever wondered why the truth feels buried under noise, this book helps connect the dots.
To close us out, we have Dweebor Evans. Again, I randomized the order of contributors in the publication and then used the same order for this podcast. So it's fitting that the final choice in a podcast about books and media is a book about language.
So my book of the year for 2025 is a book called Proto, How One Ancient Language
Went Global by Laura Spinney. And this is a fascinating journey, primarily across two continents, across Europe and Asia, on a prehistoric root language called Proto-Indo-European, that from its original location in and around the Caspian Sea, southern Russia, sort of Eastern Europe, Western Asia, as we'd think of it today, branched out into dozens, if not hundreds, of prominent languages across Europe and Asia. Some of the Germanic languages, the Italic languages, the Celtic languages, some of the Indian and Iranian, Persian languages, many of which, of course, have now subsequently had a global reach to continents outside of Europe and Asia. The beauty of the book, really beyond the linguistic puzzle, which we consider around things like the adaptation of grammar and also the vocabulary and sound changes over literally a few thousand years, the book also highlights the very prominent role that trade and migration patterns and also cultural links have had to underpin the evolution of seemingly disparate languages, but actually languages that share the same root language many thousands of years ago. So in a way, this is part a detective story to understand how languages link up. It's part a puzzle to try and fit all of these languages together, but it's also part cultural and economic history that also helps to shape both identity and also human communication. It's a thoroughly enjoyable read on the evolution of what has been one language and how that has branched out into literally hundreds of other languages across predominantly the Northern Hemisphere.
There we have it. One final note from me. This was another year of fantastic growth for the podcast, with nearly all of our top 10 most downloaded episodes coming in the last 3 months. For me, it continues to be an amazing and gratifying experience to produce and host it. And I wanted to thank everybody who's tuned in over the last year, and especially those who've subscribed and listen every week. Please stick around for another year. We're looking to up our game even more. I'll be back on January 5th with a recap of whatever goes on while we take a break, as well as some thoughts for the start of the new year. Until then, have a great Christmas, very happy holidays, and here's to a prosperous 2026. Thanks for listening to Street Signals. Clients can find this podcast and all of our research at our web portal, Insights. There, you'll be able to find all of our latest thinking on markets, where we leverage our deep experience in research on investor behavior, inflation, media sentiment, and risk, all of which goes into building an award-winning strategy product. And again, if you like what you've heard, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.